They say you can judge a man by what he eats or the company he keeps. But that's a lie. The only true measure of a man is what he does when he is starving. See, a bullet is quick, and a knife is personal. But hunger? Hunger's a slow, quiet roommate. It moves into your gut, then it crawls into your blood, and finally, it nests in your mind. It turns kings into beggars and men into animals. But there are some men you cannot starve. There are some men who, when you take away their bread, simply feed on their own rage until they are full. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was one of those men, and he was about to find out that the man sitting across from him, a man the world now called a prophet, had been fed to the wolves long before he found God. It was the winter of 1956, and the wind whipping down Lenox Avenue didn't have a temperature. It had an attitude. It cut through wool coats and rattled the windows of the storefront churches, a cold that settled deep in the bones of Harlem. Inside the warmth of the darker corners of the 22 West restaurant, the air was thick with the smell of fried chicken, cigarette smoke, and cheap perfume. It was warm, it was loud, and it was alive. But in the back booth, it felt like a funeral. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat there, the unproclaimed king of Harlem, a man who played chess with the Italian mob and always took their queen. He was cutting a steak, medium rare, the blood running onto the white china, with the precision of a surgeon. Across from him sat MalcolmX, the minister, the firebrand who was waking up Black America. But tonight, the fire was dim. Malcolm sat straight as a rod, not eating, staring at a glass of tap water like it was a holy relic. Bumpy, a man who read people better than he read the daily racing forms, saw it immediately. He saw the tremor. It was slight, just a vibration in the minister's hand as he reached for the water, a reflexive flinch when the waiter walked by with a basket of hot rolls. Most men would have ignored it. Bumpy Johnson didn't ignore anything. He laid his knife down, the silver clinking against the porcelain like a gavel in a courtroom. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. The silence spoke for itself. Malcolm wasn't fasting for God that night. He was fasting because the cold wind outside had triggered a memory he couldn't shake. He began to speak, his voice dropping below the hum of the jazz, telling Bumpy about a place called Concord Reformatory. He spoke of the year 1947, a time before the bow ties and the podiums, when he was just Detroit Red, a number in a cage. Malcolm told him it wasn't the bars that broke men in Concord. It was the kitchen. He described the segregation unit, the hole, a damp concrete box where 3 guards had decided to play God with the appetites of men. They didn't just withhold food, they weaponized it. They called it dietary discipline, but it was torture, plain and simple. Malcolm described how they would cut the rations to water and nutmeg, or dry bread speckled with mold, leaving the inmates to wither in the dark. But the cruelty was in the details. He told Bumpy how those guards would set up a fan outside the solitary cells and fry bacon or grill onions, wafting the thick, greasy scent of a hot meal into the cages of starving men. He spoke of listening to boys weep for a crust of bread, of eating the limestone dust off the walls just to stop the cramping in his stomach, and of the laughter that echoed from the guard station while he withered away, losing 20 pounds in 30 days. Bumpy listened to the story, his face a mask of stone. He looked at the most powerful voice in civil rights, and he didn't see a leader. He saw a starving boy shivering in the dark, traumatized by men who used hunger as a leash. The rage that rose in Bumpy's chest wasn't hot, it was cold, absolute zero. He realized then that a prophet shouldn't have to carry the weight of a torturer's ghost. A king doesn't let a debt like that go unpaid. Bumpy didn't offer sympathy. Sympathy is for the weak. Instead, he simply asked for the names. He demanded the identities of the men who had turned a cafeteria into a dungeon. Malcolm hesitated, speaking of forgiveness, of moving forward. But Bumpy knew better. He knew that retirement was for men who did an honest day's work, not for monsters who starved children. Reluctantly, Malcolm wrote 3 names on a napkin and slid it across the table. Bumpy didn't look at it yet. He covered it with his heavy hand, trapping the names like insects. He told the minister to eat, paid the check, and walked out into the biting wind of Lenox Avenue. The cold didn't bother him now. He was already burning with a purpose. He had 3 names, a full tank of gas, and a hunger for justice that only blood could satisfy. The hunt was on. Bumpy Johnson didn't pack a bag that night. He packed a war chest. He returned to his apartment at the Lenox Terrace, the silence of the elevator ride, serving as the only prayer he would offer for the men he was about to visit. He took the napkin from his pocket, the ink slightly smudged from the heat of his body, and smoothed it out on his mahogany desk. 3 names, 3 ghosts from 1947. To anyone else, they were just scribbles on paper, but to Bumpy, they were coordinates. They were the X marks on a map of scars that ran across the back of Malcolm Little. He didn't rush. A common thug rushes, fueled by adrenaline and stupidity. A king moves with the slow, terrifying certainty of a glacier. Bumpy picked up the telephone, but he didn't dial information. He dialed a number in the back of a pool hall in Roxbury, a contact known only as the Badger, a man who knew the underbelly of Boston better than the rats did. Bumpy needed to know where these men slept, where they drank, and what they loved. He needed to know if they had wives, debts, or secrets. Because Bumpy wasn't going to Massachusetts just to hurt them. He was going to dismantle them. For 2 weeks, the information trickled in. It arrived in hushed phone calls and envelopes slid under doors. Bumpy sat in his study, piecing together the lives of the men who had broken the minister. He learned that time had been kind to them. That was the injustice that gnawed at him. They had tortured young men in Concord Reformatory, starved them until their ribs poked through their skin like bird cages, and then they had simply clocked out. They had gone on to receive pensions. They had bought houses with porches. They bounced grandchildren on their knees, those same knees that had been used to pin starving inmates to the cold concrete floor. The dossier was complete. The first name was Officer Higgins, a man the inmates had called the Enabler. The intel said he was a weak man, a follower who laughed at the cruelty of others because he was too cowardly to participate and too spineless to stop it. He was retired now, drinking his pension away in South Boston, bragging to barflies about the good old days of keeping the inmates in line. The second name was Sergeant O'Malley, known in the yard as the Hammer. He was the muscle. He was the one who enforced the hunger. When a starving man begged for a crust of bread, O'Malley didn't give him food. He gave him the baton. He was still working, providing security at the docks, a job where his penchant for violence was considered an asset, not a liability. And then there was the third name, the Big Fish, Captain Vance, the architect. He wasn't a brute. He was a sadist in a silk tie. He was the one who designed the starvation policy, the one who calculated exactly how few calories a man needed to stay alive, but wishing he was dead. He lived in Beacon Hill now, surrounded by high fences and old money, insulated from the misery he had manufactured. Bumpy memorized their faces from grainy photographs. He memorized their routines. Then he went to his closet. He didn't reach for the flashy suits he wore to the glamorous nights at the Cotton Club. He chose dark wool, heavy and nondescript. He chose gloves made of thick leather that wouldn't leave prints. And he went to the trunk at the foot of his bed. He packed a length of piano wire, a heavy hickory walking stick, and a set of locksmith tools. He didn't pack a gun. A gun was too loud, too impersonal. This business required a touch. He told his wife, Mamie, that he had business in New England, a dispute over shipping routes. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. She didn't need to know that her husband was driving north to hunt monsters. She didn't need to know that the man she slept beside was about to become the nightmare of 3 retired civil servants. Bumpy climbed into his black Cadillac. The engine purred, a deep, menacing rumble that echoed off the brick walls of the parking garage. He didn't take a driver. He didn't take a crew. This wasn't a gang war. It was an execution of justice, and the executioner works alone. As he crossed the bridge, leaving the lights of Harlem behind in the rearview mirror, the city gave way to the darkness of the highway. The road to Massachusetts stretched out like a black ribbon. The heater in the car hummed, but the air inside felt cold. Bumpy drove with one hand on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind replaying the story Malcolm had told him. He imagined the smell of the frying bacon wafting into the cells. He imagined the hunger cramps. He imagined the laughter. And with every mile that passed, with every town he drove through, the stone in his chest got heavier. The debt was 9 years overdue. But the collection agent had finally arrived. South Boston, in the dead of winter, was a place where hope went to freeze to death. The streets were narrow, lined with triple-decker houses that looked like they were leaning in to whisper secrets to one another. Bumpy parked the Cadillac 2 blocks away from the Rusty Anchor, a dive bar that smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and regret. This was the watering hole of Officer Higgins, the man the dossier called the Enabler. Bumpy stepped out of the car. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't button his coat. He wanted the locals to see the suit. He wanted them to see the silk tie. He wanted them to know that a wolf had just walked into the sheep pen. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the bar. The conversation inside died instantly. Every head turned. In 1956, in this neighborhood, a black man wearing a $1,000 suit didn't just walk into a bar unless he was lost or looking for trouble. Bumpy Johnson was never lost. He scanned the room. He saw him immediately. Higgins was sitting in a booth near the back, a bloated, red-faced man holding court with a half-empty glass of gin. He was laughing, a wet, wheezing sound, telling a story to a bored waitress about how he used to keep the animals in line back at the reformatory. Bumpy walked over. The sound of his expensive leather shoes on the wooden floor was a rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. He didn't ask permission. He simply slid into the booth opposite Higgins. The laughter stopped. Higgins squinted, his watery eyes trying to focus. He saw the sharp cheekbones, the cold eyes, the scar that hinted at a lifetime of violence survived. He tried to muster some authority, that old guard dog bark, asking Bumpy what the hell he thought he was doing. Bumpy didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. He placed it gently on the sticky table between them. It was a single, stale crust of bread, hard as a rock, moldy at the edges. Higgins looked at the bread, then at Bumpy. Confusion washed over him. Bumpy finally spoke, his voice low and smooth, like gravel wrapped in velvet. He told Higgins that this was the menu for tonight. He told him that this dry crust was exactly what he had fed a young Malcolm Little 9 years ago. He reminded Higgins of the days he stood outside a solitary cell, laughing while men ate limestone off the walls. Higgins turned pale. The gin flush drained from his face, leaving him looking like raw dough. He stammered, trying to say it was just a job, that it was a long time ago. But Bumpy leaned in, and the air in the booth seemed to vanish. He told Higgins that time doesn't erase sin, it just compounds the interest. And Bumpy was there to collect. Higgins reached for the bottle on the table, a clumsy attempt at a weapon, but Bumpy's hand moved faster than a striking cobra. He slammed his hand down over Higgins's wrist, pinning it to the table. He didn't break it. He just held it there with terrifying strength. He told Higgins he wasn't there to beat him. A beating heals. Bruises fade. Bumpy wanted something that would last longer. He pulled a folded document from his inside pocket and slid it across the table next to the bread. It wasn't a death warrant. It was a deed. Bumpy explained with the calm demeanor of a bank manager that he had bought the loan shark note on Higgins's house. He had bought the debt on his car. He had even had a quiet, expensive conversation with the pension board about some irregularities in Higgins's file. Higgins began to shake, realizing the walls were closing in. Bumpy told him the news. As of tomorrow morning, Higgins was homeless. The bank was coming, the car was gone, the pension was frozen. The man who had starved others was about to learn what it meant to have nothing. Bumpy stood up, towering over the broken man. He told Higgins to enjoy the bread, because it was the last meal he would eat with a roof over his head. Bumpy walked out of the bar, leaving Higgins sobbing into his gin, a man whose entire life had been foreclosed on by a ghost from his past. He didn't look back. One monster was declawed, stripped naked, and thrown into the cold he had forced others to endure. But the night was young, and the next name on the list wasn't a coward like Higgins. The next name was O'Malley the Hammer. And for him, Bumpy knew that financial ruin wouldn't be enough. For the Hammer, Bumpy would need to speak the only language the man understood: pain. Taking a man's home is one thing. It strips him of his shelter, his pride, and his future. But Bumpy Johnson knew that for some men, poverty was too abstract a punishment. Some men didn't care about money because they paid in currency of pain. Sergeant O'Malley, known in the cell blocks as the Hammer, was one of those men. He didn't use a pen to hurt people. He used his hands. He used a nightstick. He used his boots. He was a physical creature, a brute who believed that might made right, and that the sound of a cracking rib was the only music worth listening to. For a man like that, you don't bring a foreclosure notice, you bring a war. Bumpy left the bar and drove toward the harbor. The Boston waterfront in the 50s was a jagged scar on the edge of the city, a maze of shipping containers, rusting cranes, and shadows deep enough to hide 1,000 sins. The fog had rolled in off the Atlantic, a thick, briny soup that swallowed the streetlights and muffled the sound of the city. It was the kind of weather that made you check over your shoulder, even if you were the only one on the street. O'Malley was working the graveyard shift at the docks. The dossier said he liked the solitude. It gave him a chance to exercise his favorite pastime, beating on drunks, vagrants, or union workers who strayed too close to the cargo. Bumpy parked the Cadillac behind a stack of crates. He stepped out into the mist. He reached into the back seat and picked up the hickory walking stick. It was heavy, weighted with lead at the handle, a gentleman's accessory that could shatter a kneecap with a flick of the wrist. Bumpy waited. He watched O'Malley make his rounds. The man was a mountain, a slab of granite in a trench coat, swinging his baton with a lazy, practiced rhythm. He walked with the swagger of a man who had never lost a fight, a man who had spent 20 years bullying prisoners who were shackled and starving. But tonight, the shackles were off. Bumpy stepped out from behind a crane, tapping the metal tip of his cane against the pavement. Clack, clack, clack. The sound cut through the fog like a gunshot. O'Malley stopped. He spun around, his baton raised instantly. He peered into the gloom, shouting for whoever was there to show themselves before he cracked their skull. Bumpy walked into the halo of a flickering streetlight. He didn't look like a dock worker. He looked like the angel of death in a charcoal wool coat. O'Malley sneered when he saw him. He laughed, a guttural, wet sound. He recognized the type, dignified, proud. The kind of inmate he used to enjoy breaking the most. He asked Bumpy if he was lost. He asked if he knew what happened to people who trespassed on his dock. Bumpy didn't flinch. He simply told O'Malley that he wasn't lost, he was looking for the man who broke Malcolm Little's ribs in 1947. He was looking for the man who smashed fingers so inmates couldn't write letters home. The recognition flickered in O'Malley's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by rage. He didn't apologize. He didn't cower like Higgins. He charged. He moved with surprising speed for a man of his size, roaring like a bull, swinging the baton for a killing blow. But O'Malley was a brawler who was used to fighting men who were too weak to fight back. Bumpy Johnson was a street tactician who had survived the razor-sharp politics of the Harlem underworld. Bumpy didn't retreat. He sidestepped. He slipped under the arc of the swinging baton with the grace of a dancer. As O'Malley's momentum carried him forward, Bumpy brought the hickory stick down. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the wrist. The sound of wood hitting bone was sickeningly loud. The baton clattered to the wet pavement. O'Malley howled, clutching his arm, but he didn't stop. He threw a clumsy, desperate punch with his left hand. Bumpy caught it, twisting the arm behind O'Malley's back, using the big man's own weight against him. He drove him face first into the side of a shipping container. The metal boomed like a drum. O'Malley slid to the ground, gasping for air, the fight draining out of him as the pain set in. He looked up at Bumpy, expecting mercy or maybe a lecture. He got neither. Bumpy stood over him, breathing calmly, the mist swirling around his ankles. He told O'Malley that this wasn't a fight. This was a receipt. He told him that every time he had raised a hand against a starving boy in a cage, he had written a check that was now being cashed. Bumpy raised the heavy hickory stick one last time. He looked at O'Malley's legs, the legs that allowed him to stand tall while others crawled. Bumpy brought the cane down. It was precise, brutal, and final. O'Malley's scream tore through the fog, a primal sound of agony that scattered the seagulls from the pier. Bumpy leaned down and whispered into the ear of the whimpering man. He told him to remember the name Malcolm. He told him that from now on, every time it rained, every time he tried to take a step, his own body would remind him of the sins of Concord. Bumpy turned and walked away, the tapping of his cane fading into the night. He left O'Malley broken in the dirt, a hammer that had finally struck something harder than itself. 2 debts were paid. The coward had lost his home. The bully had lost his strength. But the list wasn't finished. There was one name left, Captain Vance, the architect, the man who gave the orders. And for him, Bumpy had saved the darkest punishment of all. The adrenaline of violence is a tricky thing. In the moment, it burns hot, masking the pain in your knuckles and the ache in your soul. But when it fades, it leaves behind a cold, hollow silence. Bumpy sat in his Cadillac, parked on a quiet street overlooking the old Charles River. He watched the water turn black under the moonlight, his hands resting on the steering wheel, steady as stone. He had broken a man's body tonight. He had destroyed another man's life. But he felt no joy. There is no joy in taking out the trash. There's only the satisfaction of a clean floor. He checked his watch. It was 2:00 a.m. The city of Boston was asleep, dreaming its innocent dreams, unaware that a predator was moving through its veins. Bumpy lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the hard lines of his face in the rearview mirror. He looked tired, not the tiredness of lack of sleep, but the ancient exhaustion of a man who has spent a lifetime correcting the universe's mistakes. He thought about Malcolm back in Harlem, probably on his knees in prayer right now, asking for peace. Bumpy inhaled the smoke. Let the minister pray for peace. Bumpy would handle the war. He put the car in gear. The engine growled, low and menacing. He drove away from Sur, the industrial rot of the docks, heading inland. The scenery changed. The crumbling brick tenements and dive bars gave way to wide avenues and gas-lit street lamps. The smell of rotting fish and diesel fuel was replaced by the scent of manicured hedges and old money. He was entering Beacon Hill. This was where the power lived. This was where the laws were written and where the men who broke them slept under down comforters. Captain Vance lived here. The architect. The third name on the list. Vance was different from Higgins and O'Malley. He didn't smell like gin, and he didn't have calluses on his hands. He was a man of culture, a man who attended the symphony and donated to the library. He was the most dangerous kind of monster, the bureaucrat. He was the man who sat behind a mahogany desk in 1947 and signed the papers that cut the calories. He didn't have to listen to the inmates scream. He didn't have to watch them waste away. He just looked at the numbers, signed his name, and went home to his roast beef dinner. He had sterilized the cruelty, turned torture into policy. Bumpy parked the car a block away from the brownstone. The house was a fortress of respectability, with ivy climbing the brick walls and a heavy oak door that looked like it hadn't been opened for a commoner in a century. Bumpy killed the engine. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. It was the silence of people who believed they were untouchable. Bumpy reached into his pocket and touched the cold metal of the tube of industrial adhesive he had bought at a hardware store in Roxbury. He touched the set of lockpicks. He wasn't going to use the cane on Vance. He wasn't going to break his legs. That was too simple. Physical pain fades, bones knit back together. No, for the architect, Bumpy had designed a prison, a reflection. He wanted Vance to understand the specific, maddening horror of the whole. He wanted him to feel the walls closing in. He wanted him to know what it meant to be a forgotten thing in the dark. Bumpy slipped out of the car. He moved through the shadows of the elm trees, a ghost in a charcoal suit. He bypassed the front gate, vaulting over the wrought iron fence with a silent, athletic grace that defied his age. He landed in the garden, his shoes sinking into the soft, expensive soil. He looked up at the house. A single light burned on the second floor. Vance was awake. Good. It's better when they're awake. It's better when they see the judgment coming. Bumpy moved to the back of the house, to the cellar doors he'd seen on the blueprints. He checked the lock. It was a simple mechanism designed to keep out stray cats, not professional criminals. Bumpy smiled in the dark. It was almost insulting. These men thought their status was a shield. They thought the zip code was a moat. They forgot that when the lights go out, every man is just meat and fear. Bumpy picked the lock in 10 seconds. He slipped inside the house. The air smelled of floor, wax and lavender. It was warm, stiflingly so. He began to climb the stairs, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He was ascending into the belly of the beast, not with a sword, but with a mirror. He was about to show Captain Vance his own soul, and the view was going to be terrifying. The physical war was over at the docks. The psychological war was about to begin. The bedroom door clicked shut. The sound was soft, barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the house, it sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. Captain Vance woke up instantly. He sat up in his 4-poster bed, clutching the Egyptian cotton sheets. He wasn't a soldier. He was a man of softness, a man used to temperature control and silence. But the air in the room had changed. It was charged with a heavy predatory static. Vance reached for the lamp, but his hand froze when he saw the silhouette in the armchair in the corner. Bumpy Johnson sat there, legs crossed, perfectly at ease in the darkness. He looked like a shadow that had decided to wear a suit. "Don't turn on the light, Captain," Bumpy said. "Your eyes haven't adjusted to the dark yet, and you're going to need them." Vance's heart hammered against his ribs. He was a man of influence, a man who played golf with judges. He wasn't used to intruders. His instinct was indignation, not fear. He reached for the drawer of his nightstand. He knew there was a loaded .38 revolver inside, a gift from the police commissioner. "I wouldn't," Bumpy said, his voice bored. "I took the bullets while you were snoring. They're on the dresser, next to your cufflinks." Vance pulled his hand back as if the drawer were hot. He squinted into the gloom. "Who are you? What do you want? Money? Take the watch on the bureau. It's gold." "I don't want your watch," Bumpy said, standing up. He moved into a patch of moonlight. "I have my own time, and right now my time says it's 1947. Vance frowned. The date triggered something deep in his lizard brain, a memory of a prison logbook, a memory of calorie counts. "You're the one," Vance whispered, "the one who hurt Higgins, the one who crippled O'Malley." "I didn't cripple him," Bumpy corrected. "I just adjusted his stride. But you're different, Captain. You didn't swing the baton. You didn't kick the food bowls. You just signed the paper." "I was doing my job," Vance hissed, finding his voice. "It was policy, dietary discipline. It was approved by the state." "That's the problem with men like you," Bumpy said, walking closer. "You think because you wrote it down in a book, it's not a sin. You think ink washes away blood. You starved boys, Captain. You took men like Malcolm Little and you tried to turn them into dogs. You sat in this nice house eating roast beef while they ate limestone off the walls." Bumpy grabbed Vance by the lapels of his silk pajamas and hauled him out of bed. Vance was dead weight, flabby and weak. He kicked and sputtered, threatening to call the police, threatening to have Bumpy executed. "The phone lines are cut," Bumpy said, dragging him toward the door, "and your staff is sleeping very soundly. I put a little something in their tea. It's just you and me, Captain, and the architecture." Bumpy marched him into the hallway, past the oil paintings of Vance's ancestors, down the grand staircase and into the kitchen. He stopped in front of a heavy oak door reinforced with iron straps, the wine cellar. "You built this room well," Bumpy said, opening the door. "Thick stone walls, airtight, soundproof. Perfect for keeping the vintage Bordeaux at the right temperature. Also perfect for screaming." Vance saw the open door. He saw the black steps leading down into the earth. The terror finally broke him. He realized this wasn't a robbery. This was an oubliette. "No," Vance whimpered, his legs giving out. "No, please, I'm sorry. I'll pay you. I'll do anything." "I don't want your money," Bumpy said. "I want you to die it." Idusa shoved Vance forward. The captain tumbled down the stairs, crashing into a rack of expensive reds. Glass shattered. Wine spilled like blood on the stone floor. Vance scrambled to his knees, looking up at the rectangle of light. "Johnson!" he screamed. "You can't do this. I'm a human being." "So was Malcolm," Bumpy said, looking down from the threshold. "You have plenty of wine down there, Captain. Drink up. But there's no food, not a crumb. I checked. You wanted to know what hunger does to a man? You wanted to study it? Here's your chance for some field research." Bumpy slammed the heavy oak door. The boom shook the floorboards. He turned the key in the deadlock with a satisfying thunk. But a key wasn't enough. Bumpy reached into his pocket and pulled out a tube of industrial superglue. He squeezed the entire tube into the keyhole, sealing the mechanism forever. From deep beneath the floor, a muffled scream rose up. It sounded like a ghost trapped in a jar. Bumpy tapped the door once, with his knuckle. "Bon appetit, architect." Bumpy walked out of the kitchen, through the silent house and back into the night. He left the lights off. He left the door locked. He left the man who believed in walls trapped inside 4 of them. The physical war was bloody, but the psychological war was eternal. Captain Vance wouldn't die down there. Someone would find him in a few days, maybe a week. But by the time they cut through that door, the man who came out would understand exactly what it meant to be empty. 2 days later, the Cadillac rolled back into Harlem. The city was different now. The wind was still blowing, but it didn't feel as cold. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was just the heat of a job well done. Bumpy Johnson parked the car and walked straight into the 22 West. He sat at the same booth. He ordered the same steak. But this time, the air wasn't heavy. It was light. He was halfway through his meal when the door opened. MalcolmX walked in. He was carrying a stack of the Messenger newspapers, his coat collar turned up against the chill. He looked tired. The work of saving souls never ends. But he didn't look haunted. The tremor in his hand was gone. He walked with the stride of a man who owned the pavement beneath his feet. He paused at Bumpy's table. The restaurant grew quiet. the way it always did when two kings occupied the same square footage. Malcolm looked at Bumpy. He looked at the bruised knuckles on Bumpy's right hand, the ones that had connected with O'Malley's jaw. He looked at the dust on Bumpy's coat, the residue of a wine cellar in Beacon Hill. Malcolm was a brilliant man. He could read the silence between words better than anyone. "You look well rested, Bumpy," Malcolm said softly. "You been out of town?" Bumpy took a sip of red wine. He swirled it in the glass, watching the light catch the liquid. "Just a little sightseeing up north," Bumpy replied, his voice calm. "Visiting some historical sites, checking on some old debts." Malcolm studied him for a long moment. There was a report on the radio that morning, a strange story out of Boston. A prominent police captain found locked in his own wine cellar, dehydrated, delirious, screaming about ghosts and hunger. A dock worker found with a shattered leg, blubbering about a man with a cane. A retired officer suddenly homeless, crying on a park bench. Malcolm knew better than to ask. He knew that some prayers are answered by God, and some are answered by men who aren't afraid of the dark. "I heard a story on the wire," Malcolm said, his eyes searching Bumpy's face, "about the Lord working in mysterious ways." "The Lord is busy, minister," Bumpy said, cutting another piece of steak. "Sometimes he outsources the heavy lifting." A faint smile touched Malcolm's lips. It wasn't a smile of approval. The nation didn't condone this kind of violence, but it was a smile of relief. The ghost was gone. The smell of the frying bacon, the sound of the laughter, the gnawing rat in his stomach, it had all been exorcised, not by a sermon, but by a sword. "Peace be unto you, brother," Malcolm said, nodding his head. "And to you, minister," Bumpy replied. As Malcolm walked away to spread the word, Bumpy Johnson finished his meal. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and signaled the waitress. The debt was paid. The books were balanced. The men who had used hunger as a weapon were now starving in the ruins of their own lives. "Bring me the dessert menu," Bumpy told the waitress, "and bring a slice of pie for the minister to take with him. Everything tastes better when you know the rats aren't eating tonight." Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat back in the booth, the king of Harlem, watching the snowfall on Lenox Avenue. The world was still cruel. The fight was far from over. But for tonight, the hunger was gone. And that is how Bumpy Johnson settled the score for MalcolmX. A debt of pain paid in full. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more legendary tales from the streets of Harlem, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter of the underworld history. And tell me in the comments, who should Bumpy hunt next? The mob in Chicago or the corrupt politicians of New York? Until next time, keep your eyes open and never let them see you starve.